Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the National Civil Rights Museum's Imagine in America podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Jones. Today we have the distinct privilege of introducing our distinguished guest, who is a civil rights advocate and former president and director counsel emeritus of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund team, Mrs. Sherrilyn Ifill.
Hey.
Thank you for joining us on this afternoon.
I'm thrilled to be here.
At the National Civil Rights Museum, you've been able to tour the museum. Tell us what it was like being in this sacred space in which the apostle of nonviolence, Dr. King, lost his life.
You know, I've been to the museum a few times, and the power of it is undiminished. There is something about this space that is very spiritually profound, but I want to, also emphasize to people that this is a world-class museum. The exhibits are extraordinary. I'm a student of civil rights history, so if you get it wrong, I'm gonna call you out. And y'all don't get it wrong. I mean, these exhibits are incredibly informative. I learn from them as well. And I think you know this, Ryan. I brought my whole staff down here when I was still leading the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 2017. We had been through 2016, which was a tough year. We got to 2017, and I knew that we needed a space where we could reflect on who we are, on what we've contributed to this country, and on the work that was ahead, and we needed to be unified. And I decided that we would go on a staff retreat and decided this would be the place. And so we brought the entire staff of the Legal Defense Fund. I don't mean just the lawyers. I mean the folks in finance, the folks in development, the receptionists, all here to spend time really feeling the power of what civil rights is and what civil rights advocates can do. And that power, the feeling and the access to that feeling of power is available to anyone who comes through this museum. So it's such an important place.
Thank you, and congratulations on your recently acceptance of the National Civil Rights Museum's Freedom Award.
I could not be more honored. Thank you.
1868, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. And it's overturned in May 1954, an exhibition that we're in right now. When we look at what the 14th Amendment represents, what things has it advanced, and what are some of the limitations that it's showing in our current state of society today?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the 14th Amendment has never been able to reach its full promise and potential. It is, in my view, the most important transformational provision of our Constitution, and most people never learn about it. Everyone knows about their First Amendment rights. Lots of people love to talk about their Second Amendment rights, right? But what's interesting to me is the 14th Amendment is the amendment that most powerfully influenced the world that you and I live in. And by you and I mean people of our generation. We live in a 14th Amendment world. It was a reset for our country. The first Constitution was filled with compromises, as we know. Compromises like the 3/5 compromise that counted enslaved black people as 3/5 of a person in order to appease northern and southern interests in congressional representation. We know that the first Constitution allowed for the continuation of the slave trade until 1808, which they called the importation of persons. So all those compromises are in the first Constitution. The 14th Amendment is the second Constitution. This is the Constitution anchored in those 3 Civil War amendments ratified at the close of the Civil War, in which we now had to confront how we would make a true multiracial democracy. And the 14th Amendment is the centerpiece of it. And from birthright citizenship to equal protection, the concept of equality does not come from our first Constitution. I just talked about all the compromises. The concept of equality is in the 14th Amendment. That's where that word and that concept shows up. And it takes us back, it reaches back over that first Constitution to the Declaration of Independence. And I think sometimes we get it twisted. We think the Declaration of Independence is in that first Constitution. It's not. It's the Declaration of Independence that grounds us in the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal. And it's not until the 14th Amendment that our constitutional document articulates that principle from the Declaration of Independence. So it's so important and powerful to bring together the true promise of this country, but it has never fully been realized. very early on, a series of Supreme Court decisions, 4 Supreme Court decisions within 25 years, pretty much weakened the power of the 14th Amendment, and then congressional inaction in the first half of the 20th century until Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement forced Congress to pass the legislation that the 14th Amendment empowers it to enact. And that's, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and ultimately the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But prior to 1957, because we had a Civil Rights Act then too, Congress is basically dormant for the 20th century. After the Supreme Court issues its really, really devastating decisions in the latter part of the 19th century, culminating in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, then Congress just kind of goes silent on civil rights. And they are forced by the litigation of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and by the powerful activism, protest, and moral force of the civil rights movement to claim their power under the 14th Amendment to make that guarantee of equality real. So the story of the 14th Amendment is like one of the most powerful stories in our history. It is the story of how we become who we are, and it is also the story of how we have not yet become what we are supposed to be and what that amendment suggested we should be. And I'm launching this center at Howard Law School, the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy, because I want us to understand that we are 14th Amendment people. I want us to become used to, I want us to feel as comfortable talking about the 14th Amendment as some people feel talking about their Second Amendment rights. They talk about their rights grounded in the Constitution. People who are First Amendment absolutists say, you can't stop me from saying that because I have First Amendment rights or because I have religious freedom rights under the First Amendment, right? But when we talk about race and equality and justice, do we mention the 14th Amendment? No, we end up having conversations about race and justice as though we're talking about whether people are good people, as though it's a personal transaction and not a constitutional imperative. So the 14th Amendment Center is going to empower people and equip them to speak through the 14th Amendment and to give the 14th Amendment power.
Wow, interesting and very eloquent. So thank you so much. Fast forwarding, the key strategies to overcome this narrative of wokeism, critical race theory, and even the more recent attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some key things that we today can do to overcome that, to show the true meaning of them behind it?
Well, I think first we have to have a conversation about what we're fighting for. Are we fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or are we fighting for equal justice? Are we fighting for fairness? Are we fighting for an equal playing field? Are we fighting for reparations? I think there's so many dimensions to this, and I'm very cautious whenever those who are in opposition to civil rights glom onto a concept. And then they herd us all to that concept, right? And so I think one of the things that's really important, and this is the intellectual work of civil rights, is to make sure that we are, what's the song, keeping our eye on the prize? We get to decide what the prize is. They don't get to decide, right? And so I think, yes, we want to keep fighting in that space. As a multiracial democracy without diversity, equity, and inclusion, we will never have peace, and we will never have the full citizenship that the 14th Amendment wanted us to have. But I like to think we want more, and I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the more that we want. We should remember that the fight about DEI, just like the fight to maintain segregation, was not a fight premised on the idea, even though that was what they articulated, was the idea that we were inferior or that we lacked merit. It was always about competition. It was always the fear of the competition, right? We saw what happened when baseball became integrated, right? With Jackie Robinson and Curt Flood and others, right? We saw what happened. We know what happens when we enter the space. When we enter the space, we change the game. And this is about spoils. This is about wanting to hold spoils and not wanting to compete. So we also have to keep our heads straight about the fact that that's what it's about, right? It is not about we don't want you to have this corporate job, or we don't want to have race-conscious admissions in colleges and universities because you can't compete. Obviously, so many of us have been through predominantly white colleges and universities and excel at the highest level. So obviously we can compete. They know that. So that's not actually what it's about. Sure. It actually is about wanting 100% of the power. And so it's a profoundly anti-democratic movement, right? If you want 100%, black people constitute 13% of the population of this country. And I think most white people think we are 50%, right? And I think there have been many polls that have shown that. And that's good, because we punch above our weight, right? And it's also because we have such a powerful cultural influence on this country. But we should remember that, like, what they want is 100% of the power in everything. And those who adhere to the, not all white people, but those who adhere to the doctrine of white supremacy and who fear the loss of power. And this has been going on since before the Civil War. It's always been about the fear of competition, the fear that we won't have all of the power, all of the land, all of the wealth, all of the positions, all of the cultural influence, and so on and so forth. And so what I'm really interested right now in this DEI moment is that we just not jump to glom onto what they're talking about, and also how they're characterizing it. And we remember that it is at its core a fear response. It is at its core a fear response, precisely because so many of us have been so successful and are able to step to them and are able to bring what we bring to the table, which also changes the game, because we bring some special sauce to the table. And it turns out it's not just about your test score, right? It turns out that it's about the ability to problem solve. It turns out that it's about intuition and about the ability to read people. It turns out that you don't have to leave your empathy at the door in order to be powerful and to be a leader. It turns out that you have to speak many languages, right? Even if it's in the same language. It turns out that you have to be able to move through a whole variety of rooms and feel completely comfortable. So we bring different things to the table that ups the competition. And that's what this is about. It's really about it's a rear guard action to try to close the barn door after the cow has already left.
Right.
But we've already been out here, so we're not scared. We're going to do what we have to do, and absolutely we have to fight on that front. But we should keep our eyes on the prize about what we're really about, and that involves power also. That we also want power. We don't want all the power, but we want the power that we are due, and we also want to be able to link arms with allies who have a vision of an America that we share. And so that's kind of how I've been responding to this this DEI panic.
Yeah. When you look at the recent backlash of the overturning of the Supreme Court's decisions on affirmative action, and even Roe versus Wade, what does that mean for civil rights moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, and this is certainly true for me, those of us who are civil rights lawyers were raised with the conception of the Supreme Court as the instrument that broke through, right? That, with Brown and the cases that came after Brown, that we were able to open up opportunity, and that the Supreme Court was willing to overturn Plessy and to make extraordinary steps to bring us towards a more equal society. But we should remember that was like 25 years. And in the whole history of the court, its influence has been actually quite different. And in fact, we should be very alarmed, especially about this Supreme Court. In my view, I think we have seen this before. I was mentioning to you about the 14th Amendment. And I think people don't realize that there were basically 4 decisions decided by the Supreme Court after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. The Slaughterhouse case, a set of cases that were pulled together called the civil rights cases, another case called U.S. versus Cruikshank, and then Plessy versus Ferguson. Slaughterhouse case is the first case brought under the 14th Amendment that went to the Supreme Court, and it wasn't even brought on behalf of black people. It was brought on behalf of business people, of French slaughterhouse owners in New Orleans.
Wow.
And the Supreme Court read a whole provision out of the 14th Amendment, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and basically rendered it powerless in that decision. U.S. versus Cruikshank is the case that was a prosecution of a white mob involved in the Colfax massacre, which was kind of the 19th century January 6th that took place in Grant Parish, Louisiana, in which a white mob attacked the courthouse that blacks were protecting after an election because they didn't like the outcome of the election. And the Justice Department, newly empowered with the Ku Klux Klan Act, with the Enforcement Acts, prosecuted those individuals. And when the case got to the Supreme Court said, well, those were just individuals. It requires state action to use the 14th Amendment, and threw those prosecutions out. And we should remember what the consequences of that was, because President Grant had the Klan on the run, right, with the passage of the Ku Klux Klan Acts. But when the Supreme Court did that, it reopened up the possibility of the Klan and mob violence, and we all know what happened. We know what we were subjected through the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century with mob violence and lynching. Civil rights cases involved segregation and discrimination in theaters and hotels. We wouldn't have needed a Civil Rights Act of 1964 if the Supreme Court hadn't decided the civil rights cases the way they did, which once again they said it requires state action. People who are, owners of theaters, those are private individuals, and the 14th Amendment doesn't reach them. And then, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, enshrining separate but equal. I raise these four cases so that we understand that the Supreme Court can very powerfully transform this country in ways that are alarming and frightening and dangerous. 5,000 black people were lynched between 1880 and 1960, right?
Yeah, sure.
If U.S. versus Cruikshank had not been decided the way it was, and we had a robust federal government that was prosecuting those cases, right? Then it might not have quite happened that way. Think about the assault on dignity and economic development and empowerment caused by segregation and caused by the indignities of exclusion that the civil rights cases was meant to get at. And if we had a Privileges and Immunities Clause, which I still think we can have, let's wait and see on this how we do with this 14th Amendment Center,
right.
But if we had those tools. So the whole transformation and the whole kind of experience of black life in most of the 20th century was driven by those four Supreme Court cases, and we know what that life was. So when we get to a point now where we see what the court is doing, we see the court in the Shelby case weakening the Voting Rights Act. We see the court taking away a woman's right to control her body, especially knowing what the statistics are about maternal mortality for black women. Yeah. When we see the court striking down race-conscious admissions in colleges and universities, when we see these liberties being taken by the court, money in politics, and all of these huge decisions that the court is making, essentially reshaping the country, we have to remember that we've seen this before. And we can't be sanguine about it, because if we think about the consequences of those four cases that were decided over a 25-year period at the end of the 19th century, and what it meant for all of our lives, and not just for the lives of black people, but for democracy in this country. They essentially gutted the 14th Amendment, which was the promise of democracy, which was the promise of equal protection. So we should understand that that the Supreme Court holds that power, can do it, and will do it, unless we are very, very serious about understanding the moment that we're in with the court. And so it's hard for me because I'm a litigator, and I, was raised to believe that litigation, and I believe it still can do extraordinary things, and the Supreme Court can be an incredible force for democracy. But I also know that the opposite can be true, and I think we have to be clear-eyed about that.
The 15th and the 19th Amendments, and the attempts through the middle, really the entire 20th century. We take those steps forwards in Reconstruction with the rise of Black power and the political process, and it's stripped away, disenfranchised. And the same thing happens almost a century later when you see the likes of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, John Lewis, and so many others who gave their life and courage to exercise that American internal demand. And then you fast forward in more contemporary time and you see the attempts of suppressing that right to suffrage. What are some ways to continue to reignite that sense of urgency for exercising that right to vote, given in our current state of today?
Yeah, Ryan, it's a good question because I think, there are many of us for whom voting is sacrosanct. We do it all the time. We don't miss an election, and there are people who feel quite cynical about voting and who feel that our vote doesn't count. I guess the tack I've been taking, and you'll hear me talking about this because I really believe it. I just don't think we have been taught to vote for power. Somewhere along the line we got confused. And I always say I'm writing a book now, it's called Is This America? Which is the echoing of Fannie Lou Hamer's question when she appeared before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention. Because I'm so clear that Fannie Lou Hamer and Victoria Gray and Dr. King and all of the people who were engaged in this fight, particularly around voting, saw voting as a means to transform their lives and the lives of people in their communities, to make a better future for their children. Yes, there was a component to it that was about citizenship and kind of the dignity interest of voting, right, which marks you as a citizen in our country. But it was meant to actually translate into something, right? When Fannie Lou Hamer and the members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party come to be seated at the Democratic National Convention, they're not being symbolic, right? They have gone through the whole process of following all the rules and electing delegates and so forth. It's because they want their voices to be heard and they want to influence the Democratic Party platform. So I think at this moment that we have to face some truths about how we have come to look at voting. And I think we have come too often to focus more on the ceremonial aspects of it. You get your sticker, it says I voted, and not on power. And so I think the way we overcome the apathy that may exist is by not only talking about, but engaging voting as though we are seeking power to transform. Now, I want to be clear because we get nervous about power. Not power for the sake of having power, right? I do think that is corrupting, but power for transformation. And I think if we reframe how we talk about voting to talk about it in that way, it becomes easier for people to understand the potential of voting to do something that they can see, that's really transformative and not just symbolic.
One last question I want to ask you. What do you think about the shift in responsibilities of the government branches and our checks and balances?
Well, we have some fine tuning that needs to happen. Democracy is work, and one of the things I tried to do in my leadership at LDF was to move the conversation about civil rights out of where I believe it had been placed, which is kind of in a corner, in a kind of niche position, as though, it's like Black people talking or Latino people talking. I see civil rights work as democracy work, and it should be in the middle of the conversation about democracy. And that means that we should care and see the civil rights implications of when we don't have checks and balances as well, right? We see that fight happening right now with the Supreme Court and this whole ethics issue, in which essentially the Supreme Court is saying no one can check us, right? We don't recuse ourselves. What are you going to do about it? We don't, adopt, an ethics code that has teeth. What are you going to do about it? Justices don't make the financial disclosures they're compelled to make. What are you going to do about it, right? And so I think we see that tension happening. And in fact, Congress does have a lot of power. But I think we've become accustomed to Congress not exercising that power, right? It has the power of impeachment. It has the power to set the number of justices on the court. It has the power to expand or limit the court's jurisdiction. Again, power, notice the theme. But there are checks and balances built into the architecture of the Constitution that we've become nervous about taking. What we have come to do is, and I'm not sure I feel that this is a bad thing. I think as a country matures, you develop norms and ethics, and you come to rely on them more than law, which I think is okay, because law is for the outliers, right? You're a nice person. You don't need a law telling you not to steal, right? Laws are for extreme conduct. Most of us govern ourselves by a set of norms and a set of ethics that just govern our conduct, and it means we're able to move through life. I'm from New York, so if you just walk on the street, people see it so crowded. We don't really bump into each other, you know what I mean? Because there's a flow to the thing, you know that you have to keep a certain pace, you have to do it at the corner. I mean, it's getting messed up with people with their earbuds in, but for the most part, there's a rhythm to the thing, you know? It's not a law that governs how we walk on the sidewalk. So I think we became used to that. Now what we're seeing is when threats come against our democracy by people who do not adhere to norms and ethics, we kind of don't know what to do. In some instances, there are no laws to govern those excesses, that conduct. In other instances, it feels like maybe law is too much, right? So, I mean, we're gonna file suit, we're gonna prosecute, and I think we're turning around on that a little bit, but I think there was a period of just where we were frozen and unable to understand that the structural tools were placed there for a reason, and you have to be able to use them and can't be fearful about using them. So I think in some ways, if we get through this very, very challenging period as a democracy, even as an unhealthy democracy, which we are, we will have learned something. Again, about the use of power, but also about what it takes to keep your democracy healthy and what you have to do when norms and ethics don't count. You have to be able to exercise the power to protect the branches of the government, to protect the integrity of the government. We have people who no longer obey subpoenas that are issued by Congress. We have all kinds of things happening. We have people intimidating witnesses in a court, obstructing justice. These are things that are threats to the integrity of the judiciary, threats to the integrity of Congress. We have threats to the integrity of the presidency. All of this is happening. And unless we become more courageous and alert to what our obligations are in the protection of those branches, and that is democracy work, which is why we have skin in the game. And I want to see us as a Black community talking about that as well, right? Because we are democracy workers. We work to make this democracy better and more equitable. And for me, I can't really do the work if the rules keep changing. Part of being a litigator is tell me the rules, and even before conservative justices, I can win. But you gotta tell me the rules and let me work my case. But if the rules keep changing, that's a little different. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now, where there's just this fluidity about what is allowed and what is not allowed, what you and I probably would not be able to get away with, but what some people are able to get away with, even in government. So I think this is a sobering time for us to really take account of what it takes in terms of protecting those checks and balances to keep our democracy strong.
Thank you, Ms. Ifill, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. This is so fulfilling. Thank you again, and for accepting the National Civil Rights Museum's Freedom Award.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the National Civil Rights Museum's Imagine in America podcast. Continue to follow us on our social media networks and wherever you follow your podcast. Thank you. Good night.
Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.